Hello everyone and welcome back to Triple Crown Wargaming, where you join me, the Loremaster, as I bring you my hot take on Games Workshop's latest Old World Warhammer community article, The Movement Phase, introducing marching columns. So, it appears that we've got this kind of series of articles now that are going to investigate more and more about the game, and this one today is focused on movement. Now, as a long-time competitive player, this is a really interesting phase for myself. Now, lots to unpack, but I suppose the easiest way to start is the article begins looking at some stuff about formations, which I find really interesting. So, formations is something that we've talked on the channel before about how I really feel like there's some good stuff about formations in 8th. I know that people really hated the Horde, and it's not for me whether I like the mechanic of the Horde or I don't. What I like is the fact that there's kind of different bonuses for different shapes of formation. And that's something that I think could have and should have been explored a lot more in 8th, and I've talked about that on other videos in the past. And so for this article, they talk about close order, skirmish, open order, and lance. So it does appear that there is going to be some different types of formations and that they're going to have different rules. So immediately I'm quite excited about this. Now most units are apparently going to only be able to opt for close order, which when we look at the image is really simple. Close order is your classic formation, base to base contact in a square block. Lovely. Now some will be able to skirmish or open order, which I'm really interested to find out a bit more about. And obviously the lance formation is going to return to the classic sort of triangle shape for Bretonnians. Now something I immediately saw when I read this article that I thought, really interesting on that lance formation is that in all of the pictures we've seen so far, there's only 6 knights in a lance. And I had seen some people online sort of talking, well, is this going to mean that lances are kind of limited to 6 models? Now, I couldn't see that myself, personally. I couldn't see that being the case. But I have to say, I think I've been vindicated this time, because the image on this article shows a lance of 10 models. So a bigger lance, which is great. It's good to see there's going to be some kind of, it isn't going to be limited to just 6. But the next thing that really leapt out to me here was the skirmish formation image. This is crazy to me. So loose formation looks more like the sort of formation I would find in a classic skirmish game, like say Warhammer 40,000 is a good example, where I've got to have kind of a unit coherency, which they do talk about being, I believe, being an inch still, but they don't need to rank up at all. As long as they're within 1 inch of a friend, they can fan out. That is crazy. I have no idea how that is going to work in terms of charging them. Are they going to be able to rank up? How do you determine their front? I mean, in the image, they are all facing the same direction, so it would suggest that they at least need to do that. But it says they tend to be highly manoeuvrable, harrying enemies with missile fire, and then and hit and run, fade, flank charges. So really interested to see that. It seems like skirmishers might be a reasonable change, and I've got to say, my gut instinct here says that the skirmishers' line of sight and the way that they shoot has got to change, because looking at this formation, they're in like a kind of diagonal, almost sort of column effect, rather than being in the kind of classic spaced apart line that we might be used to in earlier editions of Warhammer. So they've got to be able to shoot through each other, and is that going to mean like their front arc is really slim and they're really deep? Or I genuinely don't know. This is really interesting. Now I noticed the next article in this series is shooting. I'm really interested to see if they kind of follow some more out with that there. So that's some immediate thoughts from me on that skirmish and that lance formation. Close order, nothing too exciting really. There must be the same number of models in each rank, with more models in a rank than in a file. That makes sense, which sometimes means leaving space in the back rank. Obviously, nothing too exciting there. And then some stuff that really pleases me to hear, just sort of voiced. Things that I always felt would be there, but it is nice as a long-term Warhammer player to hear them. They fight as a single entity. They walk, they wheel, they charge, they expose their flanks and their rear. And it says here, which I really like, the more full ranks you have, the greater your combat advantage. So how that plays out, whether that's supporting attacks like we've perhaps seen in 8th, or whether that's fighting in extra ranks maybe, or whether that's just to do with kind of the power of rank bonus. Perhaps rank bonus is worth more now. Perhaps a unit is more or less likely to flee based on rank bonus rather than based on what it's been in. But I mean, that's a bit like Steadfast, isn't it? So I don't know. Genuinely interesting to see that. However, there's this new kind of formation which links directly to movement, which I really like. And I've seen this in other games, or at least in other events I've seen this being used. But it does smack of kind of historical wargaming to me, which is fine because, you know, ultimately we need to remember that fantasy was based on historical wargaming. So when you need to move rapidly, units can adopt a marching column. So this means they reform into a shape that is deeper than it is wide. So the image they use is this kind of 4x5 column. So it's sort of 4 wide, 5 deep. The unit formed in this way may not charge or earn rank bonus in combat. So perhaps that's where we're getting our bigger unit with rank bonus makes. Maybe rank bonus isn't capped at 3 like it is currently. Maybe if you've got 5 ranks, you get 5. That's really fascinating. But they move at triple speed. Now, for armies like Dwarves, if they maintain that movement of 3, that's going to be really useful. Really useful, because that's going to help them get into position. But they're going to have to be careful there, because if they get caught out in that marching column with no rank bonus, if they get caught on a charge, that could be really dangerous. So, very interesting there. Marching column, definitely interesting. Now, my immediate thought was a slight panic, well, does that mean I can't march when I'm not in column? But fortunately, that is allayed later on in this article. I can, but it's this triple speed that I get from marching column, which I really like. Now, interestingly, they have this idea of open order units as well, which they still fight in ranks, but they are faster and more agile and better able to handle terrain. So I wonder if this might apply, and this is my hot take, I really haven't got a clue here, but I wonder if this might apply to units like fast cavalry currently, where they are more agile and they're faster. They kind of have that loose formation effect where they can swift reform, not swift reform, but they can reform as many times as they want during movement, but they still kind of fight in ranks. They still bust in ranks, and they still kind of contribute for steadfast and things like that. So interesting, really interesting there. I'm wondering if open order units are going to be units like that. That would be my guess at this point, but again, could be miles away from that. So overall, quite interesting. Something that does stand out here is that I think in 6th and 5th and earlier editions, I am racking my brains a few years ago now, units were 4 wide. Infantry to claim a rank bonus, and for 7th and 8th it was 5 wide was the minimum number of infantry for the rank bonus to count as ranks in that way. Interestingly, there's no mention of a minimum width, and I know that was kind of alluded to before, but it does seem that might be out now, judging by some of the stuff we've seen. There's no kind of suggestion of a minimum width, and I haven't even really started to devour the lance formation. I feel that is going to be I think that's going to be tricky to play games of Warhammer with. If it's anything like what it was like in earlier editions, but when it was this wedge shape, it was awkward, I have to say. So it's going to be interesting to see how they manage that when we get a bit more information there. But come on, let's get into the real meat. You've waited sort of 8 minutes or more to get into the real meat of this video, and that's the movement phase. And some things here that I really like off the bat. Divided into 4 parts, great. Declaring charges, moving your chargers, compulsory moves, remaining moves. This smacks of classic Warhammer, no big changes here, and some stuff that they sort of mentioned in this article I'm really excited about, and also I'm really interested to see if it makes a difference or if it does in fact stay quite similar. So first of all is declaring charges. Fantastic. Active player nominates each unit that they want to make a charge and the targets for those charges. Simple, classic. Charging units is the only way to enter combat. Absolutely fine. The caveats are standard. The target must be visible to the unit, must be partially in the unit's front arc, which is interesting. Actually, now I think about that, visible to the unit and partially in the front arc, which would suggest that perhaps some units can see things outside of their front arc. Because why would you have that? Currently, at least a part of a unit would be in the front arc for you to be able to see it. So the fact there's two parts there, that's a really interesting point for me. That might mean that some stuff can see things that aren't in their front arc. That could be even an ability for some units. That's really interesting. That could give you like an ability for things. I'm trying to think, like something like lookout nobblers, for example, that sit on top of the banner poles. Be really cool. They could have 360 arc of sight perhaps for the unit. That's quite cool. Don't know what use it'd be if you can't charge, but quite interesting. So that's interesting though. Yeah, interesting. I like that. I've said interesting about 9,000 times there. Your unit can't be fleeing. Makes sense. Interesting, can't be rallied this turn. Now, something I was really interested by, and I was talking to the Oracle about this, was the suggestion from the last article about I think it was the strategy phase they called it. Yeah, and how you sort of rallied in the strategy phase before the movement phase. And that made me say, I wonder if that means I'll be able to charge straight away again. Or, well, they're saying here you can't, but that now makes me think maybe there'll be some units that have that ability to kind of charge in again. I mean, fast cavalry do at the minute in 8th if they voluntarily flee. So maybe that'll be something that comes out like that. I don't know, that's really interesting to me. But at the minute it appears that they can't have rallied this turn. And obviously if you're already in combat you can't declare a charge. Makes absolute sense. Pre-measuring has remained. Now, there was always this kind of conspiracy, if you like, when pre-measuring came in. At the time, Games Workshop started releasing the Realm of Battle boards. We've used one on the channel in the past. And they're kind of these 24-inch by 24-inch squares, and you have 6 of them, and it makes your board up. And at the time, there was a lot of suggestion that the reason they'd taken pre-measuring out was because, you know, there was no point with those tiles. They were almost giving you lines to work your measurements out from, so there wasn't a lot of point. It's quite an interesting idea. I honestly think pre-measuring went because it was a little bit... It slowed the game down quite a lot, firstly, but with people kind of umming and ahhing over a decision for a lot longer sometimes because they thought it was a close measure. But also, I just think that it was a little bit kind of skill cappy for a lot of players. And, you know, I mean, in general, my judgment of the space wasn't the worst, so I didn't really mind it. But I think for new players, particularly trying to learn to judge the distance, I definitely think that often put them off or made them feel bad. It was a bit of a feel bad. And I think I don't like feel bads in wargaming if we can avoid them. So I'm quite pleased to see pre-measurings remained. And to be honest, it makes sense because it's basically in all their other games now, so why would it go anywhere? I'm sure there'll be some people online that really hate it, but we're where we are. I think if pre-measuring is your biggest gripe, you've had a good day out. Because there's always going to be stuff that we think, I'm not as keen on that. So it talks about kind of all the classics that you'd expect then. There's charge reactions. Really pleased to see there doesn't seem to be a lot of change here, although there is one quite exciting element added, but nothing seems to have been taken away. So you will hold as the vast majority. Stand and shoot remains. Brilliant. Love that. Classic should be in. And flee. It says pivoting around 180 degrees and trying to escape. I'm really hoping that there's a real defined clarity on that in the rulebook, because is that going to mean... What do you mean by 180 degrees? Do you literally mean they turn... so if I'm getting flank charged, do I turn to face my rear and run that way? Or do I run away from the target? I think there's probably going to be, like it is now, you turn and run away from the target. But, or rather run away from the charger as the chargee, if you will. But that 180 degrees trying to escape is going to have to be clarified. I'm sure there'll be some arguments otherwise. Classically, if you're caught on that flee, you're destroyed. Fine. Beyond that, it says there's some, especially alert units may countercharge. Now, I'm really hopeful as an Empire player that this is something that applies with detachments and that we see kind of countercharge return in quite a useful fashion, because I think it's been a little bit dulled and muted in 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy, and I'd love to see countercharging from detachments really working again. But there'll be a big question there with things like, will cavalry be able to do that? Because if you've got horses galloping at you, surely you could gallop back at them and a real smash in the middle. Everyone's charging. I don't know how that'll work. That could be really fascinating. Can't really see a lot of infantry being able to do that, because Doesn't make a lot of sense in my mind, big blocks of infantry like that. But I don't know. It's a wild guess. Perhaps it will be an ability that some particularly alert units have. For example, perhaps Witch Elves might have it. Just trying to pick a unit in my head that I think of as being alert and quick on the draw, if you like. Perhaps it'll be them or something like that. I don't know. Perhaps, who knows what it'll be based on. That could be a really interesting mechanic, because you could incorporate... I'm really spitballing now in case you've not realised, everyone. But you could incorporate something like initiative and say, well, if you pass an initiative check, you can countercharge to represent the kind of speed of reaction that someone might have. So again, something like a witch would be really good for that, but something like a troll is very unlikely to be able to countercharge. So be interesting to see. I mean, it does say especially alert units, so it's unlikely a troll would have it. But I think that's interesting to see exactly how that mechanic might work, whether you can just do it or whether there is some sort of test. But yeah, great to see. Love another charge reaction. Just adds a bit more depth of tactics to the game. Very exciting. Then you make your charge moves. Again, some huge changes here, guys, from if you're an 8th edition player. Huge changes. And actually, big changes if you're an any edition player, really, because the editions before that had fixed charge distances. So this one's big, and in the main, my gut instinct is it's good. So, I mean... I am in a positive zone, as we've discussed before, but to establish the range of your charge, you roll 2 dice, as you did in 8th. However, you pick the highest dice and add it to your movement characteristic. Now, I think one of the feel-bads of 8th edition that I've had in the past, and that I know people have had, is when your opponent rolls like an 11 or a 12 on the dice, and their infantry unit moves kind of 4 times its movement value to get charging you across the board, which feels ridiculous. And I can say I've done it at events and won tournament games, big games, important games to me, by getting lucky on the dice like that. And it is a bit of a feel bad, because you feel like you've done everything right, and because they rolled a double 6 and took a gamble, they beat you. So, and you know, there's an argument to say that that's fine, because, you know, sometimes in war people do take a gamble and it wrong foots the enemy and it catches them, and it pays off. But I really like this fact, because they give an example for skeletons, saying that ultimately now their maximum charge is 10. And I think that's a really reasonable maximum charge for an infantry unit that moves 4. You're saying they can move 2.5 times their movement maximally on a charge. I think that's very reasonable. So that is going to have a huge effect, though. It's going to slow the game down. Certainly if you're infantry-dominated lists like, say, Skaven, or... I know people saying they're not supported, but Dwarves would be another one. The game's going to slow, which opens up a couple of really interesting things. I think this movement phase stuff really tells me a lot about the style of the game that we might be seeing, because it then says Bretonnian Knights are rather more dangerous. Their Swift Stride rule adds an extra d6 to the charge. So it appears they're going to make 2d6 pick the highest plus d6 plus their move, which will probably be 8. Those cavalry are going to charge a lot further than infantry, a lot. Which makes sense, because at the minute they weren't averaging a huge amount more. If you factored out their basic movement, they're only averaging kind of 2 inches more on most charges, which seems weird in 8th. But this is going to make a big, profound difference, which tells me that I'm going to want cavalry in my list. Definitely going to want some cavalry now, because I'm going to want the ability to reach out and grab. Particularly if the game is slowing down, the superior movement of my cavalry. Imagine them in march column. That's huge. Like, that's going to be a way of me getting some speed back into my list. So I definitely think that if you're a combat type aggressor player, like I often like to be, the game is going to slow and you're going to have to really adjust your tactics from this. But that's going to mean shooting's better. So suddenly for my dwarves, maybe it's not the worst, because I can pack out some shooting for a bit longer, because I'm going to get more rounds of shooting in, because my opponent is not going to be able to close the distance as fast and charge. They could go into these march columns and push up faster that way, but then they're going to obviously have to have a point where they come out of that so that they can charge, and that's going to mean a turn of probably standing around. I imagine some sort of reform to do that. So yeah, interesting there. Really big changes. So like a lot of that. Now, what I love here is if you're in range, accounting for wheeling. So something that has been something I've seen people criticise about 8th is this kind of, you measure the closest, and then the outside edge of your unit moves 20 inches on a 12-inch charge type thing. And it doesn't happen that often. It is, the classic example would be around a building. That's when it's really quite rude, where the outside edge charges right round a round building and moves very long distance. But I think this is probably a move that's in the right direction. Again, it's part of that kind of measuring back and what feels to me like measuring back and kind of slightly slowing the pace of the game, which I don't necessarily mind, because it's going to mean that movement around your charging blocks becomes arguably even more important. So wheeling now, the distance you wheel a unit is going to count for a charge, which I think could lead to some interesting other shenanigans where I move up and make my charge and then let you close the door to me, perhaps. I don't know. It's definitely interesting. They're going to need to see the full detail of those rules to really understand that. It does say maximum number of models from both sides must be brought into combat, so the idea of maximisation still seems to have remained. And this next point's interesting, because I read this one way, and then I spoke to the Duke, and he read it quite a different way, which I thought was interesting. But so it says, if you whiff the roll, the charge is failed. The unit moves the full distance rolled towards the target, but your warriors haven't got the impetus to complete the charge and are ripe to be hit back. Now, I read that as the full distance rolled. So you roll your 2d6, you say you roll a 6, and say you roll a 5 and a 2, and you need a 6. You move 5 inches. The Duke said to me, no, I don't read it like that. I read it as the full distance rolled, which is your move plus the dice. So if it's that, you could be like 1 or 2 inches in front of an opponent. Failing a charge could be absolutely catastrophic in this game. So that's definitely gonna just deter me from making those charges where I need 5s and 6s too often, because that could be absolutely catastrophic. Now, once you've got through all of that, you move to compulsory moves. Really pleased to see some good stuff here. Fleeing units still move as part of this phase, fine. Random movers remained, and they give some examples, which are current random movers, Night Goblin Fanatics, Stone Trolls who failed their stupidity test. What I love here is it does appear that stupidity is probably going to stay vaguely in its current form. That is to say, if you failed a test, you move randomly, you don't get the control over your troops. So great, yeah, love that. Love the fact that I've kind of kept some really flavourful rules, because I really like stupidity. I think it's a great flavoured rule. Don't get me wrong, it drives me mad when I failed a test, but I think it's got tons of flavour and I love that. And then finally, remaining moves. Not a huge shock. Just regular manoeuvres. So then it gives us a little bit of a very short discussion about the kind of mechanics of movement. And really, for me as a long-time Warhammer player, it just gives me a lot of reassurance, if I'm honest. Moving and marching still appears to be in. So you move up to your movement characteristic and can then shoot. Great, moving and shooting's fun. If you march, you double your pace, but sacrifice the ability to perform any manoeuvre that isn't a wheel, and you can't shoot. So that appears to be the same. The thing that's missing here that's going to be really interesting is if the Swift Reform has remained. If it has, I think we're going to see almost no change into kind of the basic mechanics of movement there from the current 8th edition rules, which weren't, in honesty, a huge change from previous sets. So I'm not sure why you'd need to change it. It then talks about wheeling, which is very much the exact way that it's always been. You kind of pivot from one of the front corners. Very fine, normal, job done. And then interestingly, I'm not sure if Swift Reforming will be in, because wheeling is as it was, as I say, move from the outside model. But then it says you may also turn 90 or 180 degrees. So if you turn 90, you spend a quarter of your movement. If you spend 180, you spend half your movement. You can also move backwards or sideways, half movement. Redress the ranks or reform. So I'm not sure what the difference between redress the ranks and reform is going to be. So that's really interesting. I've not seen anything about redress the ranks, unless I've missed it in another article, but that'll be interesting to see what they mean by redress the ranks. But that could be a combat reaction thing. Perhaps if you've been beaten in combat, perhaps you might become kind of disordered or something like that. I don't know. There are like other historical war games that have like the idea of disorder, and then like order needs to be restored. So perhaps that's redressing the ranks. I don't know, but that makes me think that, you know, we know there's going to be kind of a variation in combat results. That's kind of been talked about a little bit in other articles. So perhaps that's one of the options. You could become disordered and you need to redress your ranks. Don't know. Very interesting there. But turning and reforming are separate things. So we're going to have to see exactly how that plays out. Perhaps if you turn, you can't shoot. I don't know. And as a result, there might be a Swift Reform still. Or perhaps this means the end of Swift Reforms. Which would be a shame, because I think one of the things that was brilliant about 8th edition was the way that it got more out of things like your musician. The musician really didn't have much of a role or as much of a role in earlier sets of rules. And I think it's nice that he kind of helps you with the drawing of combats, he helps you with rallying, and he helps you with this kind of manoeuvring in 8th. I really like that, so I really hope that kind of isn't lost too much, because I think that would be a bit of a shame. So I've kind of talked through my initial gut feelings. Overall, I'd say really excited here, guys. Lots to discuss, bucket loads in this article. And it really feels like they're stepping up the pace now. I suppose the only thing that is left on my mind, which I'm really, really upset to say that the article doesn't answer for me, is a burning question. A burning injustice, if you will. But a burning question for myself, which is, will spiders move 8 inches now? Or will they still be consigned to the travesty, the crime, if you will, of a 7-inch movement with 8 legs? I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Remember to like, subscribe and share and all of the usual jazz. Thanks for joining me on this reaction to another Old World post, and I look forward to speaking to you real soon about the next things that Games Workshop let us know.
Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share. Then head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.
What are you doing, mate?
You alright? Do it for